The Trump Doctrine, shock and awe, applied to the Middle East. They called him crazy, self-centered, unpredictable. But maybe that was exactly what the world needed to wake up. Trump didn't just go down in history as a politician. He went down as a psychological phenomenon. While many leaders were still playing chess, he was already gambling with the fate of the planet. And, in the midst of the world's most unstable board game, the Middle East, he applied a 1990s military principle that would redefine modern politics: shock and awe. But here's the paradox. The man who promised peace acted like someone lighting matches near gunpowder. And it worked, because his goal wasn't to prevent chaos, but to control the narrative about him. When Trump said, "The war is over," the world didn't breathe a sigh of relief. It held its breath. His diplomacy was a spectacle, an emotional weapon designed to manipulate perceptions, bend enemies, and seduce audiences. He understood that in the information age, whoever dominates attention dominates power. The result was an unprecedented doctrine, part theater, part strategy, part prophecy. An explosive combination of strength, faith, and unpredictability that still shapes the behavior of entire nations today. But what was really behind the so-called Trump Doctrine? Was it strategic genius or manipulation on a global scale? Brace yourself, because what you're about to read isn't just about politics, it's about the emotional engineering of power. The birth of doctrine. How Trumpism became a global strategy. No one imagined that a construction businessman, famous for reality shows and explosive phrases, would end up shaping a new way of doing global politics. But Trumpism was born precisely from this unlikely blend of spectacle, boldness, and calculation. The doctrine didn't emerge in offices or think tanks. It was born on the stage of public opinion, where every word is a bombshell and every gesture a strategic map. It was there, amid applause and criticism, that Trump realized something simple and powerful. Fear and admiration go hand in hand. While many were trying to understand his intentions, he was already several moves ahead. Every tweet, every controversy, every carefully rehearsed improvisation was part of an impactful choreography. It was shock and awe applied to political communication. Trump quickly learned that, in times of information saturation, it's not the most beautiful speakers who win, but the loudest and most unexpected ones. This is how he transformed unpredictability into a weapon and chaos into a method. And this formula, between genius and instinct, began to transcend borders. From Washington to Tel Aviv, from Tehran to Moscow, the Trump effect began to be studied, copied, and feared. Leaders realized that it wasn't just about politics, but about controlling the masses' emotions. And it is precisely here that the doctrine was born, not as a military manual, but as a psychological mirror of contemporary humanity. A reflection that will become even clearer when we look at what inspired such a bold strategy. The origins of shock and awe, and the psychology of political domination. The term shock and awe wasn't born with Trump. It comes from a 1990s American military doctrine designed to subdue the enemy not just through force, but through impression of absolute power. The idea was simple and brutal. Win before the war even began, paralyzing the opponent with fear. Precise bombing, aggressive communication, and displays of force were as important as gunfire, because true victory was psychological. Trump understood this better than many generals. When he applied this concept to politics, the battlefield became public opinion. His every appearance was a media explosion calculated to leave his opponents bewildered and the public mesmerized. Remember when he challenged journalists in the middle of a press conference or fired ministers on Twitter? That wasn't just impulsiveness. It was strategic theater. The intention was clear, to show that he called the shots, and that resisting him was like trying to stop a hurricane with your bare hands. At its core, shock and awe is about controlling perception. It's the art of creating a spectacle so intense that no one can look away. And that's exactly what turned politics into entertainment, and power into spectacle. But what seemed like just a media ploy began to expand, first on screens, then across borders. And it's at this point that the doctrine takes shape, when the stage of communication becomes the geopolitical board. The legacy of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars in the new geopolitics. The scars left by the Iraq and Afghanistan wars still bleed across the world map. Those conflicts, fought in the name of freedom, revealed the psychological and political cost of seeking dominance through force. Shock and awe was tested there in its rawest form. Skylit bombings, fiery speeches, quick victories, followed by years of chaos. Trump observed all this not as a soldier, but as a strategist of chaos. He realized that modern warfare didn't need tanks, it just needed shape the perception of the enemy and the audience. While generals talked about battles, Trump talked about headlines. He understood that in the 21st century, real war is fought on screens, not in trenches. Iraq was a wake-up call. No invasion wins hearts. It only temporizes fear. Afghanistan confirmed the failure of brute force. 2. Decades of military presence only to see the Taliban return to power. Trump learned the lesson, but reinterpreted it. If physical dominance is unsustainable, psychological dominance is eternal. Therefore, his doctrine does not seek to conquer territories, but rescue. He observed the erosion of the old American strategy and decided to replace it with something more theatrical, more emotional, and infinitely more effective. Every speech, every alliance, every veiled threat carries this legacy. That of an empire that traded bombs for narratives. And it is precisely from this point on that the Trump Doctrine ceases to be mere rhetoric and begins to rebuild American power based on image and impact. Rebuilding the American image under the slogan, "Strength and Unpredictability." When Trump took office, the United States was tired of long wars, costly alliances, and a reputation as a world savior that no longer convinced even Americans themselves. It was then that he understood something essential. Power didn't have to be loved, just feared and respected. This was the basis of his image reconstruction. He traded diplomatic rhetoric for direct, almost brutal pragmatism. Instead of promising stability, he offered strength. Instead of predictability, he delivered the unexpected. And that's when the world began to watch, intrigued and uneasy. Unpredictability became his method of symbolic domination. Every untimely statement, every sudden encounter with enemy leaders, every sudden retreat was part of the strategy. Trump knew that uncertainty is the new power. When no one knows what you're going to do, everyone is watching, and whoever dominates the attention dominates the narrative. Thus, he repositioned the United States not as a patient mediator, but as a dangerous and indispensable player. It was the reinvention of influence through controlled fear. But there was also a refined psychological calculation behind it. "Make America Great Again" wasn't just a slogan. It was an emotional, almost spiritual, call for a nationalist rebirth. Trump understood that a country's strength begins with the pride of its people, and he used that energy to fuel his foreign policy. While former allies doubted his stability, enemies reconsidered their moves. The world once again moved to Washington's rhythm, and silently, a new war was born. The war of global narrative. Weaponizing media, the narrative. War Trump never needed tanks to dominate the world. A smartphone was enough. He understood that in the century of hyperconnectivity, the media is the new battlefield. While traditional politicians tried to control headlines, he controlled the algorithm. Every tweet, every calculated provocation, every strategic silence was a bomb dropped on the heart of modern communication. The goal wasn't to inform, but to direct emotions. And, let's face it, Nothing is more powerful than an emotionally engaged crowd. He turned polarization into fuel. Every criticism from the press reinforced his narrative of persecution. Every opposing headline became proof that he was fighting the system. It was a masterful reversal. The more he was attacked, the stronger he appeared. Trump used the media against itself, a tactic Sun Tzu would surely have applauded. While journalists sought logic in his speeches, he was already focusing on visual impact, reactions, and buzz. It was entertainment disguised as politics, and few realized that spectacle was the strategy. This narrative war shaped not only his image, but also the behavior of leaders around the world. From the Middle East to Europe, many copied his direct, provocative, and emotional style. Diplomatic speeches gave way to incendiary tweets. Peace conferences were replaced by viral videos. And in this scenario, the Trump Doctrine found the perfect breeding ground. Because where there is information chaos, there is room for those who dominate the storyline. And the next step in this domination would come with the power of the unexpected. The power of surprise. Quick decisions, media impact, and psychological effect. Trump understood early on that predictability is the greatest enemy of authority. Surprise, on the other hand, breeds fear, respect, and dependence. His decisions seemed impulsive, but they rarely were. Every sudden shift in stance, a handshake with enemies, a Twitter threat, a sudden retreat in negotiations, was carefully designed to generate immediate impact. He knew that the modern world reacts to speed, and whoever controls the pace dictates the narrative. When Trump spoke, the planet stopped to listen. Not always to agree, but always to react. This use of surprise wasn't just political, it was psychological. The human mind is drawn to what breaks patterns. That's why, while diplomats waited for protocols, Trump created plots. When he announced the historic meeting with Kim Jong-un, for example, the world oscillated between astonishment and curiosity. And that was precisely the point. 2. Control global attention, alternating between tension and relief, fear and hope. Traditional diplomacy became outdated in the face of this new theater of power. The effect was immediate. Foreign leaders began to weigh every word, unsure of what to expect. Investors watched the market cautiously. Analysts tried to decipher signals. Trump had transformed the element of surprise into a geopolitical tool. It didn't matter whether his actions were successful. The mere fact that he could alter the course of events with a single sentence was a demonstration of dominance. But the true genius of this tactic is revealed when he takes the game to the most delicate field on the planet, the Middle East. Trump and the Middle East. From the promise of peace to the control of influence. Few terrains are as explosive as the Middle East, and Trump knew it. When he took office, he promised to end endless wars and bring soldiers home. But behind the peace talk lay something deeper, a desire to redefine American influence over the most volatile region on the planet. He didn't just want to end wars, he wanted to redraw the board. And to do so, he applied his shock and awe doctrine surgically, sometimes diplomatic, sometimes incendiary. While the world expected retreat, he moved in unthinkable directions. He moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, recognizing the city as Israel's capital, a gesture that sparked equal parts applause and fury. At the same time, he cut aid to Palestine and tightened his grip on Iran. It seemed chaotic, but each move followed a logic. Weaken old alliances and force new balances. The Middle East became their geopolitical chessboard, where every move was an act of symbolic power. The promise of peace was, in fact, a redefinition of control. He sought not harmony, but predictability under American command. The peace agreement that would come later, the Abraham Accords, was not an altruistic gesture, but a masterstroke of strategic repositioning. Israel gained legitimacy, Arab countries gained trade, and the U.S. reaffirmed its authority as the master of regional tensions. And it was precisely in this experiment that Trump Doctrine began to take concrete shape. The Abraham Accord as a laboratory of doctrine. The Abraham Accords were more than peace treaties. They were an experiment in psychological power. By bringing Israel closer to historically rival Arab nations, Trump wasn't just signing papers. He was rewriting the rules of modern diplomacy. The idea was simple and ingenious. Trade fear for opportunity, conflict for convenience. Instead of emotional speeches, he offered concrete benefits: trade, technology, security. The message was clear. Peace would not come through love, but through mutual interest. And it worked. The United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco joined the agreement, breaking decades of Israeli isolation. Trump presented the achievement as a milestone in the new American policy: peace through pragmatism. But what seemed like a conciliatory gesture had a deeper layer: the repositioning of the U.S. as an indispensable arbiter. He achieved something decades of traditional diplomacy had failed to achieve, transforming former enemies into economic partners, without the need for troops, just influence and timing. These agreements served as the testing ground for the Trump Doctrine, a global-scale power experiment. He demonstrated that manipulating perceptions and the calculated use of surprise could produce previously unthinkable diplomatic results. It was shock and awe without the bombs. The impact lay in the sudden shift in political behavior. But behind this apparent success, a new tension was emerging. After all, no alliance built on self-interest is completely stable, and this instability would be the perfect fuel for the next chapter: Israel's role in this power play. Do you want me to continue with this tone, more analytical and geopolitical, in Topic 9? Or would you prefer the next one to bring a more symbolic touch, exploring the religious and emotional factor of Israel within the Trump Doctrine? Israel's role and the balance between faith, power, and survival. Israel has always been more than a strategic ally of the United States. It is a symbol of survival, a religious and political bastion in the heart of a territory in constant turmoil. Trump understood this with the precision of someone who knows how to play chess with spiritual pieces. By recognizing Jerusalem as the capital and strengthening Israeli sovereignty, he wasn't just pleasing a partner. He was activating the collective emotion of millions of Christians and Jews, both inside and outside America. Faith became a diplomatic tool, and the sacred, an instrument of power. This alliance was one of the most visceral expressions of the Trump Doctrine. He didn't treat Israel as an ordinary country, but as a moral pillar of Western narrative, a symbolic shield against extremism, and, at the same time, an outpost of American influence. Every gesture, every visit, every official photo was charged with theological and geopolitical significance. What many saw as blind support was, in fact, a calculated move, securing the loyalty of a vital ally and the fervent support of a deeply religious electorate. But this union of faith and power also brought a new kind of tension. By reinforcing Israel as the epicenter of Middle East politics, Trump reignited the flames of age-old disputes, not just territorial, but spiritual. The shock and awe doctrine now expanded into the realm of belief, where weapons are words and prophecies. And it was in this same context that he had to face one of the most dangerous adversaries, not militarily, but symbolically: Iran. The relationship with Iran, between threats, sanctions, and symbolic diplomacy. Trump saw Iran not just as a political enemy, but as the embodiment of the challenge to the American order. From the beginning, he made it clear that there would be no room for subtlety. Either Tehran would yield or face the consequences. By withdrawing the U.S. from the 2015 nuclear deal, he dismantled years of diplomatic negotiations with the stroke of a pen. The gesture was symbolic and calculated, a message to the world that the era of complacency was over. And as with all his doctrine, impact trumped consensus. Economic sanctions came like invisible bombs. They didn't destroy cities, but suffocated economies, triggering internal collapses and political tensions. Trump weaponized the dollar, and international trade became a battlefield. At the same time, he used rhetoric as a precision missile. "Never threaten the United States again," Tehran tweeted in all caps, a theatrical gesture, but one with immense psychological weight. Fear of an American reaction became more effective than any military strike. And paradoxically, this calculated aggression opened the door to symbolic diplomacy. When he ordered the strike that killed Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, Trump knew he was playing chess on a mind board. The world held its breath, expecting war. But Iran responded with restraint. The message was clear. It's not about destroying, but about dominating through unpredictability. And while the East adjusted to this new logic, another dimension of power entered the scene. The economic one, where oil and influence would become the empire's new weapons. The energy game, oil, gas, and regional economic power. No conflict in the Middle East can be understood without discussing oil. And Trump, with his business sense, saw black gold not just as a resource, but as power currency. His doctrine did not just seek to control wells, it sought to control the rhythm of world energy. While pressuring Iran with sanctions, he strengthened ties with Saudi Arabia and bolstered American domestic production. The goal was clear: to transform the United States into the world's energy hub and weaken adversaries who relied on oil as a political weapon. But the game was more sophisticated than it appeared. Trump understood that oil isn't just fuel for engines, it's fuel for entire economies. Every price fluctuation could destabilize governments, spark uprisings, and redraw invisible borders. Thus, he used the energy market as a silent tool of coercion. When he cut off Iranian exports, it wasn't just for safety's sake. It was a test: who still had the courage to defy Washington? And the answer was almost always silence. At the same time, it invested in strategic alliances with producing countries, offering protection and commercial advantages in exchange for political loyalty. It was the old imperial game, adapted to modern capitalism. Oil became the lever of the shock and awe doctrine, not through force, but through dependence. And as this control solidified, a new challenge loomed on the horizon: the interference of rival great powers willing to redraw the balance of power in the Middle East. And that's where Russia and China come in. The role of Russia and China in the balance of power in the East. If the Middle East is the stage, Russia and China are the directors who prefer to act behind the scenes. Trump knew this, and that's why his doctrine was never limited to direct confrontations. With Russia, the game was mutual admiration and distrust. Putin saw Trump as a strong and unpredictable leader, a mirror of himself in another hemisphere. Trump, however, saw Putin as a worthy rival, someone who understood the power of image and narrative. As a result, their interactions always seemed contradictory: public cordiality, subterranean tension. It was a chess game of symbolic power. China, on the other hand, represented the silent strategic rival. While the world's eyes were focused on tensions in the Gulf, Beijing was advancing its new Silk Road, buying influence with investments and infrastructure. Trump realized that the war of the future would not be with tanks, but with data and ports. His response was a mix of trade, barriers, and displays of power, not to destroy, but to contain. The digital Cold War between Washington and Beijing became the backdrop for the new doctrine. Russia and China watched America's shock and awe closely and learned quickly. Moscow used the tactic in Syria. Beijing applied it to the global economy. Trump had unwittingly exported a philosophy of power: dominance by impact not invasion. And as these giants moved silently, the world began to realize that war had changed form. The bombs were now tweets, contracts, and satellites. But none of this would be effective without the essential ingredient: controlling public perception. The manipulation of public perception, fear, hope, and spectacle. Trump understood something few leaders do. People don't vote on facts, they vote on emotions. He realized that fear and hope are the two most powerful forces in the human mind, and that by balancing them, he could guide public opinion like a conductor conducts an orchestra. The shock and awe doctrine applied to communication consisted of precisely that, creating intense emotional peaks, alternating between the dread of collapse and the promise of redemption. The result was a public always on alert, always connected, always reacting. He turned the news into a thriller. A tweet could send stocks tumbling, an impromptu speech could calm markets, and all of it was meticulously calculated. Trump understood the rhythm of the networks. He knew that attention was the new oil. His every gesture was designed to generate emotional engagement, and in this field, truth mattered less than impact. The important thing was to be the center of the plot, the unquestionable protagonist of the chaos. He created an aesthetic of power, exaggerated, theatrical, hypnotic. But the manipulation of perception wasn't limited to the American public. In the Middle East, his every word was interpreted as a sign of war or a promise of peace. In just a few years, Trump had reshaped the concept of leadership. He stopped being the man who commands and became the man who defines what the world feels. Fear and fascination became his most precise weapons. And as the planet's emotions swayed to the rhythm of his words, a new element began to mix into this formula: religion, which would be used as the moral and political cement of this doctrine. The use of religion as a tool for political legitimization. In the Trump Doctrine, religion wasn't just faith, it was geopolitics in sacred robes. Understood that no discourse mobilizes as much as a divine appeal. In the United States, he used Christian rhetoric to transform his image from a controversial businessman into an instrument of God, someone chosen to restore values and protect the nation. In the Middle East, he applied the same principle on a global scale, aligning the political narrative with the spiritual. When speaking of Israel, he wasn't just talking about territory, he was talking about biblical promise, prophecy, and destiny. This symbolic use of faith served as both shield and sword. The shield, because it shielded his actions from moral criticism. After all, who questions someone who claims to be guided by God? And the sword, because it divided the world between those who are with the good and those who oppose the divine plan. Thus, Trump managed to unite religious conservatives, Zionist leaders, and even evangelical groups in different countries under a single spiritual banner. Politics became liturgy and power, a cross held high before the cameras. But this fusion of faith and power also brought a new kind of war, moral war. When religion and politics mix, debate fades and gives way to conviction. And that's precisely what strengthened the shock and awe doctrine. A power sustained not just by fear, but by belief. By transforming politics into faith, Trump reached the deepest point of control, the emotional and spiritual. And it is in this scenario that the next element of this strategy emerges: the diplomacy of unpredictability, the method that no one can predict, but everyone fears. The diplomacy of unpredictability, method or strategic chaos. Unpredictability has always been seen as a flaw in diplomacy, until Trump turned the flaw into doctrine. He understood that, in the world of international politics, doubt is more powerful than threat. When allies and enemies don't know what to expect, everyone is on high alert, and whoever controls the climate of uncertainty controls the game. Trump used this like few others. Now he extended his hand. Now he brutally withdrew it. Now he praised authoritarian leaders. Now he publicly condemned them. Everything seemed random, but each move followed the logic of impact. His chaotic style was actually a psychological dominance strategy. In negotiations with North Korea, for example, he alternated insults and praise, threats and invitations to historic meetings. The world saw a show. He saw an emotional chess match. This game baffled his adversaries, who couldn't decide whether they were dealing with an unpredictable diplomat or a brilliant strategist. And while everyone tried to decipher his next moves, Trump maintained control of the narrative. The diplomacy of unpredictability is dangerous, but effective when applied with precision. It creates an environment where fear and curiosity coexist. And it was in this context that Trump cemented his image as the leader who no one could ignore. Doubt became his greatest ally. Suspense his instrument of power. But every method based on emotional impact carries a cost, the psychological effect on entire nations. And it is precisely at this point that the doctrine ceases to be political and becomes a collective phenomenon. The impact of shock and awe on the collective psychology of nations. Shock and awe doesn't just affect governments. It affects Rescue. Trump understood that true power lies in the ability to shape collective emotions. When a population lives in a constant state of surprise, fear, and excitement, it becomes more susceptible to charismatic leadership. The same principle that paralyzed enemies in war began to be applied to modern politics. People stopped analyzing facts and started reacting to sensations. It was the birth of a new form of control, emotional manipulation on a global scale. On social media, this phenomenon amplified. Every fiery speech, every polarizing headline, every unpredictable act by Trump served as an attention trigger. The human brain is programmed to seek security amid chaos, and, paradoxically, it was the chaos itself that kept the public engaged. Entire countries began to respond not with reason, but with emotion. The fear of instability generated more engagement than any promise of stability. Politics became a neurochemical spectacle. But the impact went beyond the borders of the United States. The world began to operate under the same emotional rhythm. Leaders imitated the aggressive style. Media competed for greater shocks. Populations lived in cycles of indignation and euphoria. Shock and awe ceased to be military doctrine and became method of emotional government. And as the planet grew accustomed to the sound of these explosive words, the reactions of allies and enemies revealed an interesting pattern. They were all, in some way, dancing to the same beat of the same maestro. The reactions of allies and enemies to the Trump Doctrine. No global leader failed to react to the Trump phenomenon, whether with revulsion, admiration, or sheer bewilderment. America's traditional allies, such as Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, found themselves caught between astonishment and dependence. They criticized his behavior in public, but behind the scenes, they tried to decipher the secret of his influence. Trump defied diplomatic etiquette, but produced tangible results. He was the leader everyone said they feared, but no one dared ignore. The shock and awe doctrine had become an involuntary manual of contemporary power. Enemies, in turn, learned to deal with the unpredictable. Iran, China, and even North Korea realized that confronting Trump head-on was futile. The real battleground was psychological. While the United States displayed force and spectacle, these countries adopted the tactic of silent containment, trying to resist the emotional impact. It was like fighting a hurricane. The best defense was to wait for the wind to change. Even so, fear of American reaction served as a brake, a fear carefully cultivated by doctrine. And among allies and enemies, a new type of leader emerged. The Trump Global. Political figures who adopted the same provocative, nationalist, and media-driven tone. From Brazil to Hungary, from Turkey to Italy, politics began to be inspired by the aesthetics of confrontation. Trump had created an archetype, not just an administration, and this archetype spread like a cultural virus, redefining how power was communicated. But, most intriguingly, this doctrine wasn't limited to the present. It pointed to the future of modern wars, which would no longer be fought with bombs, but with perceptions. What the doctrine reveals about the future of modern warfare. The wars of the future will not begin with sirens, but with notifications. The Trump Doctrine anticipated this new era in which power is measured by the ability to manipulate information, not launch missiles. Today, war takes place in people's feeds, on stock exchanges, and in their minds. Every fake news story is a bullet. Every hashtag, a digital troop. Trump realized that narrative dominance is the new territorial dominance. He demonstrated that a well-timed tweet can have more impact than an airstrike, and, most frighteningly, without leaving a visible trace. Surveillance technologies, algorithms, and artificial intelligence have become the new geopolitical weapons. Governments now fight not for land, but for data and attention. Trump, even without the technical language, sensed this scenario and intuitively exploited it. Digital shock and awe, the flood of messages, the informational chaos, and the constant bombardment of stimuli creates an exhausted population, unable to distinguish truth from manipulation. In this confusing terrain, whoever offers a simple and powerful narrative wins, even if it is illusory. This is the strategic legacy of the doctrine, transforming war into a continuous spectacle. The enemy is no longer a country, but doubt. The battlefield is the psychological, and the audience is the soldier who doesn't even realize he's fighting. And as the world adapts to this new reality, a disturbing question arises. To what extent can power manipulate the truth without losing control of it? This is the most dangerous frontier of the Trump era. The limit between influence and manipulation, which will shape the 21st century. The line between power and manipulation. When peace is just a stage under the Trump Doctrine, peace was never the absence of conflict. It was tension management. Every agreement, every conciliatory speech, every historic photo had a script behind it. He understood that, in the age of appearances, symbolism is worth more than substance. Thus, peace became a theatrical play. Spotlights, flags, calculated smiles, and a global audience watching, believing, and reacting. The power lay in controlling the perception of the war's end, even as the war continued disguised as sanctions, propaganda, and surveillance. Political manipulation reached a new level. What was once done in the shadows of diplomatic backrooms now happened in front of the cameras. Trump didn't hide his game. He turned the game into a spectacle. Shock and awe ceased to be about physical destruction and became about building illusions. Peace, in this context, became a marketing commodity. Sold, displayed, used as a political trophy. Truth, in turn, became a negotiable detail. But this boundary is unstable. When manipulation becomes routine, trust disappears. And without trust, all peace is temporary. The world began to realize that the so often heralded end of conflicts was nothing more than an interlude between new crises. Trump may have sensed this, maybe even desired it. Because in his doctrine, tension is the source of power. And so, by staging peace, he wrote the prologue to a new era, an era in which the control of reality would become the final battlefield. The lasting legacy, the Trump Doctrine, as a symbol of the 21st century. The Trump Doctrine is not just a set of policy decisions, it is a mirror of the era in which we live. It revealed that modern power no longer relies on tanks, but on attention, not on armies, but on narratives. Shock and awe has ceased to be a war tactic and has become a leadership philosophy, where immediate impact trumps long-term coherence. Trump embodied the spirit of a century driven by spectacle, speed, and emotion. A century in which being remembered is more important than being right. His legacy is controversial but undeniable. He altered the DNA of political communication and inspired a generation of leaders who see chaos not as a risk, but as strategic tool. The line between politics, entertainment, and manipulation has officially been erased. The global stage has become a massive reality show, with each nation competing for viewership, not ideology. In this context, Trump was not an anomaly. He was a harbinger of the world that is emerging. A world where truth is flexible and power is performative. The Trump Doctrine remains open code, reinterpreted by governments, corporations, and social movements. It demonstrated that perception is the new weapon, and influence the new empire. Perhaps, in the future, scholars will see it as the point at which politics ceased to govern bodies and began to govern. Rescue. The 21st century begins, then, with a silent lesson. Whoever masters the fear and fascination of the masses masters the world. And history will inevitably continue to echo the same name. The Trump Doctrine. The power of impact and the new face of war. The world Trump helped shape will not soon be forgotten. He proved that modern power doesn't need tanks to dominate. It just needs control, attention, and fear. His doctrine demonstrated that a speech can shake markets, that an image can win a battle, and that the true battlefield today is the human mind. And like him or not, it's impossible to deny. Trump's shock and awe has changed the way nations view force, diplomacy, and even truth itself. But now the question is, how far will this go? How far can a leader manipulate perceptions without losing control over them? How many psychological wars are we already experiencing without realizing it? Perhaps the greatest lesson of this doctrine is that power lies not in whoever speaks the loudest, but in whoever decides what everyone will hear. And this realization, more than any bomb, is what defines the 21st century. So, what do you think about all this? Do you think the shock and awe was strategic genius or dangerous manipulation disguised as leadership? Leave your opinion in the comments, and if you want to continue diving into in-depth analyses like this, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, we don't just tell the story, we decipher the power behind it.